Elizabeth Taylor lived on painkillers and chemicals more than she did on food. Starting from the potent painkillers administered under the studio's watch, when she broke her back at age 12, her body turned into a machine, patched together by surgical scars and ruined organs. She was treated by the studio as a mere commodity, with lawyers ready to sue her for damages even while she lay dying in her hospital bed. That was the steep price paid for 2 Oscars, a billion-dollar empire, and the title Queen of Hollywood. She was the most powerful woman of the 20th century who saved millions of AIDS patients, yet could not save herself. The glory belonged to humanity, the money to the studio, and the only thing that belonged to her was a body shattered by chemicals. 1940s. Hollywood was not a dreamscape of art and culture. It was heavy industry. Its ruthlessness was indistinguishable from the steel mills of Pittsburgh or the assembly lines of Detroit. The Big Five studios functioned as cartels, controlling every aspect of the cinematic supply chain. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was the most efficient factory of them all. Under the iron-fisted rule of Louis B. Mayer, MGM operated as a totalitarian state within Los Angeles. It had its own police force, its own fire department, its own schools, and most critically, its own medical infrastructure. In this ecosystem, actors were not artists. They were talent. The term itself is deceptive. In the ledgers of MGM, talent was listed under assets, depreciating over time, requiring maintenance and fuel. A child entering this system was stripped of their autonomy the moment the ink dried on the contract. A contract usually signed by parents blinded by the reflection of gold. For a child star, the studio dictated their diet, their sleep, their public appearances, and their physical growth. They were units of production. If a camera cost $10,000 and a child actor cost $10,000, the studio viewed them as possessing equal rights. None. Into this grinder, a small, dark-haired girl with a genetic mutation that gave her a double row of eyelashes was fed. Elizabeth Taylor was beautiful, yes, but to MGM, she was raw ore. And like any raw ore, she needed to be refined, smelted, and hammered into a shape that could be sold to the masses. The abuse of Elizabeth Taylor was a two-pronged assault. One prong was the corporation, the other was the family. Behind every child star broken by the system, there is almost invariably a parent pushing them into the gears. For Elizabeth, that force was her mother, Sarah Taylor. Sarah was a frustrated actress, a woman whose own ambitions had curdled into a vicarious obsession. She did not view Elizabeth as a daughter to be protected, but as a project to be managed. Sarah was the perfect foreman for the MGM factory floor. She ensured that Elizabeth was obedient, that she smiled on cue, and that she never complained of fatigue. It was Sarah who colluded with the studio executives to alter the physical reality of the child. When executives remarked that the 10-year-old's smile was not quite adult enough, not quite perfect for the high-definition lenses of the era, a decision was made that borders on physical assault. They did not wait for nature to take its course. Persistent Hollywood narratives suggest that healthy baby teeth were extracted before they were ready to fall out, and permanent teeth were allegedly filed and manipulated to achieve the perfect symmetry required by the lens. Elizabeth was a child when she was strapped into a dentist's chair. The procedure was not for health, but for aesthetics. Parts of her body were removed because the studio deemed her natural state insufficient for the bottom line. This was the first lesson she learned. Her body did not belong to her. It belonged to the camera. Pain was simply the price of admission. The systemic negligence culminated in a single catastrophic event that would define the rest of Elizabeth Taylor's life. The year was 1944. The film was National Velvet. The asset was 12 years old. The production was plagued by the war effort and budget constraints. Authenticity was the watchword. The studio needed the young girl to write a high-spirited gelding named King Charles. Elizabeth was an accomplished rider, a natural equestrian, but she was still a child, and the horse was a massive, unpredictable animal. In a sane world, a stunt double would take the dangerous jumps, but stunt doubles cost time, and they cost money to wig and costume. Mayer wanted the shot. He wanted the audience to see the girl's face as she took the fences. During a crucial take, the physics of the situation turned deadly. King Charles missed time to jump. The violent motion threw the 12-year-old girl from the saddle. She hit the earth with sickening force. The sound of her body impacting the packed dirt silenced the set. In that fraction of a second, the architecture of her spine collapsed. She suffered a compression fracture. Vertebrae were crushed. Discs were slipped and ruptured. It was an injury of profound severity, the kind of trauma that, in a modern medical context, would trigger a code trauma. It required immediate immobilization on a backboard, emergency transport to a spinal trauma center, potential orthopedic surgery, and months of absolute bed rest in a cast. But this was not a hospital. This was MGM. And the patient was not a girl, she was a production delay. What happened next is the smoking gun of the studio's criminality. Sarah Taylor and the producers did not call an ambulance. They did not shut down production. The logic was cold and financial. If they stopped filming, the insurance premiums would spike and the schedule would slip. Instead, they told the girl to stand up. When she cried out that she couldn't move, that the pain was blinding, they didn't offer a stretcher. They brought in the studio doctor. These physicians were the unsung villains of the Golden Age. Their Hippocratic oath, first, do no harm, had been replaced by a corporate mandate. First, get the shot. The doctor did not order an X-ray. He ordered a cocktail. He administered strong painkillers, likely morphine or a synthetic opioid derivative, to a 12-year-old child. The message was explicit. We will not fix the injury, we will silence the body's scream. Elizabeth was put back on the horse the very next day. She rode for the remainder of the film with a broken back. Every jump, every trot, every jolt sent shockwaves through her fractured spine, grinding bone against bone. The only thing keeping her upright was the chemical blockade in her bloodstream and the terror of disappointing her mother and the studio bosses. Her spine healed, but it healed wrongly. It fused in a distorted alignment, creating a structural weakness that would haunt her for 70 years. This was the patient zero moment of her physical destruction, but more dangerously, it was the patient zero moment of her psychology. At 12 years old, Elizabeth Taylor was taught the most dangerous lesson a human being can learn. When you are broken, you do not stop. You take a pill. The bottle of painkillers handed to her in 1944 was not medicine. It was a gateway. It was the beginning of a pharmacological leash that MGM would use to control her for the next 2 decades. She had survived the fall, but the Elizabeth Taylor who climbed back onto that horse was no longer a normal child. She was now a chemically dependent component of the studio machine running on borrowed time and synthetic relief. The tragedy was not that she fell. The tragedy was that they forced her to stand up. The injury of 1944 was the inciting incident, but the studio's intervention did not stop at the spine. As the immediate trauma of the fall calcified into chronic pain, MGM faced a new, more pervasive threat: the inevitable biological maturation of their property. The chemical management used to treat the injury would soon be repurposed to manage the girl herself. The bottle of painkillers was merely the opening salvo in a war against her own physiology. By 1945, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer faced a logistical crisis. Their most promising asset, Elizabeth Taylor, was battling an enemy that no contract could sue and no lawyer could injunction: puberty. In the sanitized narrative of Hollywood history, Elizabeth Taylor's transition from child star to ingenue is depicted as a blossoming, a natural evolution like a flower opening to the sun. The forensic reality was far more coercive. To the studio executives, the biological maturation of Elizabeth Taylor was a threat to their investment. They had marketed a sweet, innocent girl who loved horses. They were terrified that she would become a woman with desires, curves, and autonomy. The studio's response was to declare war on her physiology. As her body began to change, Louis B. Mayer, a man who viewed his actors as chattel, became obsessed with her dimensions. He did not see a developing teenager. He saw a product deviation. In meeting rooms filled with cigar smoke, grown men discussed the circumference of her waist and the development of her chest with the clinical detachment of butchers grading livestock. Mayer was known to be verbally abusive, famously referring to the young Taylor as fat in front of the cast and crew. This was not merely an insult. It was a psychological conditioning tactic designed to trigger body dysmorphia. The studio demanded she bind her chest to flatten her silhouette and placed her on starvation diets. While other teenagers were consuming the calories necessary for bone density and brain development, Elizabeth was restricted to meager portions of cottage cheese and dry toast. The long-term metabolic damage of this period cannot be overstated. By starving a body that was simultaneously trying to heal a spinal fracture and navigate puberty, the studio likely triggered the metabolic instability that would plague her weight fluctuations for the rest of her life. They were breaking the engine before it had even finished being built. However, the greatest crime of this era was not the restriction of food, but the introduction of a new fuel source. As Elizabeth transitioned into more demanding roles, the schedule intensified. A standard day on the MGM lot began at 4:30 a.m. for hair and makeup, and often did not end until 9 p.m., 6 days a week. It is physically impossible for a growing human adolescent to maintain this level of alertness and performance naturally. The body demands rest. MGM's medical department had a solution. In the late 1940s, the dangers of amphetamines were not publicly understood, but their utility was perfectly clear to studio executives. They were marketed as diet pills or vitamin shots, a euphemism that masked their true chemical identity. Every morning, when the exhaustion of the previous 18-hour day threatened to keep Elizabeth in bed, the studio doctor would administer the upper. This was likely benzodrine or dexedrine. Pharmacologically, these drugs act on the central nervous system by flooding the brain with dopamine and norepinephrine. They trigger the fight-or-flight response. For Elizabeth, the effects were immediate. The fatigue vanished, replaced by a jittery, laser-focused intensity. Her pupils would dilate, enhancing those famous violet eyes. Her appetite would vanish, pleasing Louis B. Mayer, and she would hit her marks with robotic precision. But the human body is not a perpetual motion machine. It is a biological system of checks and balances. By artificially spiking her adrenaline levels for 12 to 14 hours a day, the studio was redlining her cardiovascular system. Her heart rate was constantly elevated. Her blood pressure was artificially high. She was running a marathon while standing still. The problem with running an engine on rocket fuel is that you cannot simply turn it off. When the director yelled cut at 9 p.m., Elizabeth was sent home, but her body was still vibrating with amphetamines. Her mind was racing. Sleep was chemically impossible. Yet, she had to be back in the makeup chair at 4:30 a.m. This created the necessity for the second half of the cycle, the downer. To counteract the stimulants, studio doctors prescribed heavy sedatives, barbiturates, Seconal, red devils, and Nembutal, yellow jackets. These drugs are central nervous system depressants. They do not induce natural restorative sleep. They induce a coma-like state. They forcibly shut down the brain's electrical activity. Under the influence of barbiturates, the body does not cycle through the necessary REM, rapid eye movement, stages of sleep, where emotional processing and memory consolidation occur. So, the cycle was established. Morning, chemical stimulation to force the body awake. Day, sustained sympathetic nervous system arousal, high stress. Night, chemical sedation to force the body into unconsciousness. By the time she was 18, Elizabeth Taylor's circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that regulates every hormone and organ in the human body, was obliterated. She had lost the ability to sleep or wake without pharmaceutical intervention. She was no longer living. She was being operated. In 1950, at the age of 18, Elizabeth attempted to break out of the prison. She did what many captives do. She married the first person who offered her a different life. That person was Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the heir to the hotel empire. To the public, it was the wedding of the century. The photos show a fairy tale princess in satin smiling at her handsome prince. But the forensic lens reveals this was merely a transfer of ownership. She had moved from the custody of MGM to the custody of a man who was arguably more dangerous. Hilton was an alcoholic and a gambler with a violent temper. He did not want a wife. He wanted a trophy that stayed on the shelf. The honeymoon in Europe was a nightmare of abuse. The physical trauma Elizabeth endured during this brief marriage is a critical component of her medical history. According to Taylor's later accounts, Hilton kicked her in the stomach during a drunken rage. At the time she was pregnant, the resulting miscarriage was not just an emotional tragedy, it was a physiological disaster. The trauma of a miscarriage caused by blunt force abdominal injury involves significant internal hemorrhaging and uterine damage. In the 1950s, the medical procedures to treat such trauma, often dilation and curettage, D and C, were invasive and carried risks of scarring, Asherman syndrome. This event added another layer of scar tissue to her reproductive system, compounding the skeletal issues from her childhood fall. She was 18 years old, divorcing an abuser, mourning a child, and returning to the studio that had sold her the fairy tale in the first place. By the early 1950s, the girl who had starred in National Velvet was gone. In her place was a woman who had been hardened by the fires of industry and abuse. She returned to MGM, but the dynamic had shifted. She needed the studio's protection, and she needed the studio's doctors. The addiction that had been foisted upon her as a tool of production had now become a mechanism of survival. She needed the pills to numb the emotional pain of the miscarriage and the physical pain of her back. The studio, sensing her vulnerability, pushed her harder. Films like Father of the Bride and A Place in the Sun were churned out. On screen, she was the picture of radiant health. Her skin was flawless, her eyes bright, but this was a triumph of lighting and makeup over pathology. Internally, her organs were beginning to show the strain of the upper/downer cycle. Her liver was working overtime to metabolize the cocktail of toxins. Her immune system, deprived of restorative sleep and proper nutrition, began to falter. This was the incubation period for the near-fatal illnesses that would strike her in the coming decade. Elizabeth Taylor was becoming the greatest actress in the world, not because of her training, but because she was living a performance every second of every day. She was performing the role of a healthy human being while her biology was slowly collapsing under the weight of the studio system's greed. By the close of the 1950s, the Elizabeth Taylor machine was running on a mixture of sheer will and toxic fuel. But machinery pushed beyond its design limits inevitably suffers catastrophic failure. The slow accumulation of metabolic damage and immune suppression was about to culminate in a sudden, violent system crash. The narrative was shifting from maintenance to emergency resuscitation, and the location of the collapse would be a damp, smog-choked London. By the late 1950s, Elizabeth Taylor was no longer just an actress. She was a walking comorbidity. The cumulative effects of the spinal injury, the starvation diets, the miscarriage, and the decade-long reliance on amphetamines and barbiturates had stripped her immune system of its natural defenses. She was 29 years old, but her biological resilience was that of a geriatric patient. In 1961, while in London to begin production on Cleopatra, the inevitable happened. The damp, smog-choked air of the city infiltrated her weakened lungs. What began as a strain of the Asian flu rapidly metastasized into a catastrophic case of staphylococcal pneumonia. This was not a common cold. It was a total respiratory shutdown. Her lungs, filled with fluid, could no longer exchange oxygen. She was rushed to the London clinic, her skin turning cyanotic, the terrifying blue-gray hue of oxygen deprivation. The medical reports from that night are harrowing. Her heart stopped. For 5 minutes, Elizabeth Taylor was clinically dead. The doctors were forced to take extreme measures. In a desperate bid to bypass the obstruction in her throat and lungs, they performed an emergency tracheotomy. They sliced through the skin and cartilage of her neck, inserting a tube directly into her windpipe to mechanically force air into her system. This procedure saved her life, but it left a permanent, visible scar at the base of her throat. For any other actress, a scar on the neck would be a career-ending disfigurement. For Taylor, it became a symbol of her durability. However, the forensic reality of a tracheotomy is brutal. It involves a lengthy, painful recovery where speech is impossible and the risk of infection is astronomical. She was a woman who had essentially been beheaded and stitched back together, yet the machinery of Hollywood was already grinding its gears to put her back to work. While Elizabeth lay in a coma, fighting for every breath, the true nature of her relationship with the studio system was laid bare. Cleopatra was being financed by 20th Century Fox, a studio that was financially overextended and desperate for a hit. To them, Elizabeth Taylor was not a dying woman. She was a depreciating asset and a liability. Historical accounts suggest that while the doctors were fighting to restart her heart, the studio's lawyers and insurance adjusters were gathering in boardrooms. They were not drafting eulogies. They were drafting lawsuits. They were preparing to sue her estate for the production delays caused by her death. They argued that her illness was a breach of contract. This is the cold, metallic heart of the industry. The studio had demanded she work herself into a state of collapse, and now that she had collapsed, they intended to penalize her for it. The moment she regained consciousness, the pressure began. There was no convalescence. There was no year off to heal her ravaged lungs or rehabilitate her atrophied muscles. The production was moving to Rome, and she was required to be there. She was resurrected, not by rest, but by chemistry. To combat the lingering inflammation in her lungs and the systemic shock, she was placed on high doses of corticosteroids. These drugs are powerful anti-inflammatories, but they come with severe side effects: mood swings, water retention, and the characteristic moon face, swelling. Simultaneously, the pain from the tracheotomy and her chronic back issues required management. The opioid dosage was increased. She arrived in Rome not as a healed woman, but as a chemically sustained entity, propped up by a cocktail of steroids, painkillers, and sedatives. The filming of Cleopatra in Rome is often remembered for the scandalous affair between Taylor and Richard Burton. But through a medical lens, it was a scene of physical torture. The production was a chaotic disaster, plagued by heat, dust, and delays. Elizabeth was forced to wear elaborate, heavy costumes, some weighing over 30 pounds. For a woman with a fused spine and a healing neck wound, the physical burden was excruciating. Every hour in those costumes was an assault on her compromised skeletal structure. There are scenes in the film where her performance seems distant, almost ethereal. Critics praise this as regal detachment. A forensic analysis suggests a different cause. She was likely acting through a haze of semi-consciousness. There were days when she had to be physically helped to the set, her body so stiff from pain and inflammation that she could barely walk. Once the cameras rolled, the adrenaline or the amphetamines would kick in, and she would deliver the line. When the director called cut, she would collapse back into the chair, a puppet whose strings had been severed. She was acting through a throat that had been sliced open only weeks prior, projecting her voice to the back of the soundstage, while her trachea was still knitting itself back together. This was the show must go on, taken to its logical, lethal extreme. It was in this state of extreme physical vulnerability and chemical alteration that she met Richard Burton. Their affair is legendary, but it must be understood in the context of their shared pathology. Burton was a functioning alcoholic, a man who medicated his own demons with whiskey. Elizabeth, already primed by the studio's pharmacological conditioning, began to match him drink for drink. Alcohol became the new anesthetic. It potentiated the effects of the painkillers and sedatives she was already taking. The combination of opioids, barbiturates, and alcohol is a deadly triad. It depresses the respiratory system. Given her recent pneumonia and compromised lung capacity, every night of drinking was a game of Russian roulette. The violence of their relationship, the screaming matches, the physical altercations, can also be viewed through this chemical lens. They were two people whose nervous systems were constantly oscillating between extreme stimulation and extreme sedation. Emotional regulation was impossible. By the time Cleopatra wrapped, Elizabeth Taylor was the most famous woman in the world. She was the highest paid actress in history. But medically, she was a wreck. She had survived the studio's attempt to work her to death, but the cost was permanent damage to her metabolism, her skeleton, and her addiction pathways. The studio system had formally ended, but the damage it had installed in her biology would operate for the rest of her life. The Cleopatra era proved that Taylor could survive acute trauma, but the cost was a permanent destabilization of her structural integrity. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the adrenaline of the studio years faded, leaving behind a body that was no longer just chemically dependent, but physically crumbling. The era of the soft tissue crisis was over. The era of the hardware failure had begun. The bill for decades of steroid use and high-impact performance was about to be paid by her skeleton. By the late 1960s and entering the 1970s, the Elizabeth Taylor entity was a global brand, a diamond-draped icon of excess and passion. But beneath the caftans and the oversized jewelry, the biological infrastructure was disintegrating. The bill for the studio's medical mismanagement was finally coming due, and it was being paid in bone. The most devastation occurred deep within her skeletal system. During the filming of Cleopatra, and in the years following, Taylor had been treated with high doses of corticosteroids to manage inflammation, pneumonia, and various allergic reactions. While these drugs are effective at suppressing the immune system, they carry a sinister side effect when used in excess, avascular necrosis. This condition essentially starves the bone tissue of blood. The bone dies, crumbles, and collapses. In Taylor's case, the target was her hips. The very joints responsible for mobility began to rot from the inside out. This was not the arthritis of an elderly woman. This was the chemical erosion of a middle-aged woman's skeleton, a direct result of the pharmaceutical regimen prescribed to keep her working. The pain of bone rubbing against dying bone is profound. It is a grinding, nauseating agony that permeates every movement. To manage this, the cycle of opioids intensified. She was not taking pills to get high. She was taking them to walk. She was a statue beginning to crumble at the pedestal. If one were to examine the medical timeline of Elizabeth Taylor during this period, it reads less like a patient's chart and more like a mechanic's logbook for a car that has been in too many collisions. She became a pioneer of surgical endurance. Over her lifetime, she underwent more than 30 major operations. This included a hysterectomy, which surgically removed the reproductive system that the studio had once monitored so invasively. She suffered from bouts of dysentery, amoebic infections, and perforated ulcers. Her body was in a constant state of rebellion, rejecting the stress placed upon it. But the most significant reconstruction involved her hips. In a time when joint replacement was still a relatively aggressive procedure, Elizabeth Taylor became a cyborg. Both of her hip joints were removed and replaced with artificial prosthetics, titanium and polyethylene components hammered into her femur and pelvis. She was literally held together by metal and screws. The spine, fused since 1944, remained a source of chronic torment. Her movement became stiff, her gait altered. The public saw a diva who demanded to be carried or used wheelchairs. The forensic truth was a woman whose chassis had suffered structural failure. Simultaneously, the world began to mock Elizabeth Taylor for her weight. The tabloids published photos of her fat phases, labeling her a glutton. This shaming ignores the metabolic chaos that had been engineered into her body since childhood. Recall the starvation diets of the 1940s and the amphetamines used to suppress her appetite. When she finally broke free from the studio's direct control, her metabolism was shattered. Years of upped and downed thyroid function, combined with the immobility caused by her crumbling hips and back pain, made weight regulation nearly impossible. Furthermore, the steroids she took for her inflammation caused significant water retention and fat redistribution. Her weight gain was not a moral failing. It was a symptom of a confused endocrine system trying to survive decades of manipulation. She was fighting a war against her own biology, and the media cheered for her defeat. The culmination of this physical and chemical tragedy arrived in 1983. Elizabeth Taylor became the first celebrity to openly admit herself to the Betty Ford Center for Addiction. The public narrative was that she was an alcoholic, a woman who partied too hard with Richard Burton. While true, this is a reductive analysis. The intake assessment at Betty Ford would have revealed the deeper truth. She was a polysubstance-dependent pain patient. She was addicted to the painkillers prescribed for her broken back and rotting hips. She was addicted to the sleeping pills prescribed to counter the insomnia programmed into her by MGM. She was addicted to the alcohol used to potentiate the pills. Her stay at Betty Ford was not just about getting sober. It was about deprogramming the studio system, operating system. She had to learn for the first time in 40 years how to exist in her own skin without chemical buffers. She had to learn that pain was a signal to be felt, not silenced. It was an act of supreme bravery. She stripped away the glamour and stood before the world as a broken woman trying to heal. Sobriety, achieved in 1983 cleared the chemical fog, but it could not undo the decades of structural damage. With her mind finally clear, Taylor was forced to inhabit a body that was rapidly betraying her. However, this clarity also brought a new perspective. She was no longer just a victim of her own physiology. She was becoming a witness to the fragility of others. It was this shift in consciousness that set the stage for her final and most physically demanding act. Not as an actress, but as a warrior in a new kind of plague. While her psychological armor explains her resilience, it does not account for the biological anomalies that plagued her from birth. A complete forensic examination is impossible without looking at the blueprint itself. Beneath the trauma inflicted by the studio and the strength forged by her will, there lay a genetic code that was simultaneously a gift and a curse, a mutation written into her very cells that dictated her fate long before she signed a contract. To truly understand the biological entity that was Elizabeth Taylor, we must go deeper than the bone and the scars. We must look at the DNA itself. Elizabeth Taylor was famous for two physical traits: her violet eyes and her double row of eyelashes. In the beauty magazines of the 1950s, these were hailed as gifts from the gods. In a medical genetics textbook, they are classified as a mutation. The double row of eyelashes is a rare condition known as dystichiasis. It occurs when an extra row of lashes grows from the meibomian glands, the oil glands of the eyelid. While aesthetically striking, creating a natural smoky eye effect that the cameras loved, it causes chronic irritation. The lashes often turn inward, scratching the cornea, trichiasis. Taylor underwent surgeries to remove offending lashes that threatened to blind her. However, forensic medicine compels us to look at what else this mutation signifies. Modern medical theorists strongly suggest this is the hallmark of a genetic disorder known as lymphedema distichiasis syndrome, often caused by a mutation in the FOXC2 gene. This syndrome is characterized by dystichiasis, double eyelashes, lymphedema, chronic swelling of the limbs due to a compromised lymphatic system, congenital heart defects, structural weaknesses in the cardiovascular system. Reviewing Taylor's later life, the clinical correlation is striking. She suffered from chronic severe swelling in her legs and ankles, often dismissed by the press as weight gain, but clinically consistent with lymphedema. She died of congestive heart failure. It is a haunting possibility that the very mutation that made her a star, the eyes that captivated the world, carried within it the genetic code for the heart failure that would eventually kill her. The studio did not know this, of course. They saw a pretty girl, but a retrospective analysis suggests she was fighting a genetic war on two fronts: the external industrial abuse of MGM and the internal sabotage of her own DNA. Having mapped the invisible terrain of her genetics and the chemical composition of her blood, we must finally address the surface. The damage inflicted upon Elizabeth Taylor was not just internal, it was inscribed upon her skin. By this stage in her life, her body had become a topographical map of survival. Most stars of her era went to great lengths to hide their surgical histories, retreating into seclusion until the stitches dissolved. Elizabeth Taylor did the opposite. She accessorized her trauma. The silver-white line at the base of her throat from the tracheotomy became a focal point. Instead of hiding it with high collars, she framed it with diamonds. It was a permanent modification of her instrument, tethering the skin to the trachea and creating the breathless, husky voice she became famous for in her later years. When she exposed this scar, it was a radical act of defiance, forcing the industry to look at the violence it had inflicted upon her to get the shot. Deeper still were the scars of the womb. Her reproductive history was a series of medical emergencies, including multiple C-sections performed with vertical, classical incisions that cut through abdominal muscle. These surgeries, combined with her hysterectomy, left her abdomen a landscape of adhesions and scar tissue. These were not just medical marks. They were evidence of a body that had been cut open, repaired, and stitched back together repeatedly to sustain the demands of her existence. She was not just prone to illness, as the tabloids suggested. She was a systems failure caused by excessive load-bearing. These scars were not merely private reminders of pain. In the age of the burgeoning 24-hour news cycle, they became public property. As the studio system's wall of silence crumbled, Elizabeth Taylor's medical history was dragged into the light. The private war map of her body was published for the world to see, transforming her physical agony into a spectator sport that the public consumed with voracious appetite. In the 1940s, when Elizabeth Taylor fell from the horse, the studio erected a wall of silence. The public was told she had a minor tumble. The medical records were sealed in MGM's vault, accessible only to Louis B. Mayer and the company doctors. Her body was private property, owned by the corporation. By the 1970s, however, the studio system had collapsed, and with it, the wall of protection. Elizabeth Taylor entered a new terrifying phase of her existence. She became the world's first medical reality star. She was no longer owned by a studio, she was owned by the public. And the public was voracious. They did not just want her movies, they wanted her medical chart. Every hospitalization, every sneeze, every fluctuated pound became a headline. The paparazzi did not just camp outside her premieres. They camped outside Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. They were betting on her mortality. This shift marked a profound psychological violation. Pain is an inherently vulnerable private experience. When an animal is wounded, it retreats to a dark cave to heal. Elizabeth Taylor was denied the cave. She was forced to heal in a glass box with flash bulbs popping every time she grimaced. The most brutal aspect of this spectacle was the public's obsession with her weight. As we have established, the cocktail of steroids and metabolic damage made weight regulation nearly impossible. But the culture of the time did not care about the why, only the what. The tabloids treated her body as a carnival sideshow. Comedians made careers out of mocking her girth. Joan Rivers famously joked, "Elizabeth Taylor has more chins than a Chinese phone book." John Belushi played her on Saturday Night Live, choking on a chicken bone. This was not comedy. It was a collective act of bullying against a woman whose endocrine system was failing. The public was essentially laughing at the side effects of the medicine that was keeping her alive. They mocked the swelling caused by the steroids that allowed her to breathe. They mocked the immobility caused by the hips that had crumbled in service to the screen. Throughout the 1990s, the tabloid industry developed a macabre genre, the Elizabeth Taylor Death Watch. Every time she entered a hospital, which, given her fused spine, hip replacements, and heart condition, was frequent, the headlines would scream, "Liz's final days, the end is near, saying goodbye." Imagine the psychological toll of reading your own obituary on a weekly basis. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, recovering from brain surgery or a hip replacement, and turning on the television to see pundits debating how much your estate will be worth when you die. This constant narration of her impending death created a strange feedback loop. The public began to view her not as a living person, but as a character in a lingering death scene. She was Schrodinger's actress, perpetually half dead and half alive in the public imagination. Yet, she always walked out. There is a famous photo from one of her hospital discharges. She is frail, sitting in a wheelchair, but she spots the paparazzi. Instead of hiding, she lowers her sunglasses, looks directly into the lens, and flashes a smile that is half dazzle, half snarl. It was a visual message. I am still here. You lose. In her final decade, Elizabeth Taylor made a visual choice that redefined the celebrity image. Most stars, when they become infirm, vanish. Greta Garbo hid in her apartment. Marlene Dietrich refused to be seen. They wanted to preserve the illusion of eternal youth. Elizabeth Taylor refused to hide the hardware. She began appearing at red carpet events, charity galas, and even Michael Jackson's funeral in a wheelchair. This was a custom-built, intricate machine, often encrusted with rhinestones or gold leaf. She did not treat the chair as a prison. She treated it as a throne. By doing this, she forced the world to confront the reality of the aging body. She was saying, yes, I am the most beautiful woman in the world. Yes, I am broken. These two things are not mutually exclusive. She normalized the image of disability in high glamour spaces. She showed that a woman could be frail, unable to walk, and physically compromised, yet still command the room, still wear the diamonds, and still be the most powerful person in the building. It was her final act of rebellion against the industry that had tried to discard her the moment she showed a flaw. Yet in a twist that no studio executive could have scripted, Elizabeth Taylor reclaimed the narrative of her own public suffering. Instead of allowing the medical spectacle to humiliate her, she realized that her familiarity with hospitals and impending death gave her a unique power. She took the visibility of her own broken body and used it to shine a light on a crisis the world was desperate to ignore, transforming her victimhood into a weapon of mass empathy. In the 1980s and 90s, Elizabeth Taylor shocked the world by becoming the most vocal champion for HIV/AIDS victims. While society ostracized gay men, treating them as pariahs, Taylor walked into hospice wards and held their hands often covered in Kaposi's sarcoma lesions. Biographers attribute this to her friendship with Rock Hudson, but a forensic psychological profile suggests a deeper, more visceral connection. Elizabeth Taylor did not just sympathize with the dying, she identified with them. She knew what it was to be betrayed by one's own biology. She knew the humiliation of the hospital gown, the cold sterility of the examination room, and the feeling of the body withering away while the mind remained lucid. When she looked at men wasting away from AIDS, she did not see strangers. She saw fellow combatants in the war against physical fragility. Her activism was rooted in her own medical history. She used her fame, the very commodity that had been extracted from her broken body, to force the world to look at a disease it wanted to ignore. She was a woman held together by screws and scars, standing as a shield for those who were too weak to stand. In forensic terms, she acted as a human adjuvant. In pharmacology, an adjuvant is a substance added to a vaccine to boost the immune response. Taylor added herself to the AIDS crisis to boost the global emotional response. She didn't just attend fundraisers, she stormed Capitol Hill. There are accounts of her walking into the offices of conservative senators, men who would publicly denounce homosexuality, and using her star power to extort them. She would essentially offer a trade. I will take a photo with you. I will make you look cool to your constituents, but you will vote for this funding bill. If you don't, I will make sure the press knows you turned away Elizabeth Taylor. She understood that her glamour was a currency, and she spent every cent of it on research. She famously said, I used my fame like a heavy wedge to open doors. A woman whose own body had been exploited for profit was now exploiting the exploiters. From a medical standpoint, one of her most radical interventions was non-pharmaceutical. It was tactile. In the mid-'80s, the fear of transmission was hysterical. People believed you could get AIDS from a toilet seat or a handshake. Patients were treated as biohazards. Elizabeth Taylor walked into the hospice wards of Los Angeles and New York. She did not wear a mask. She did not wear gloves. She sat on the beds of dying men, men covered in the purple lesions of Kaposi's sarcoma, men who had wasted away to skeletons, a physical state she understood all too well from her own battles with weight and illness. She took their hands. She hugged them. This was a massive public health intervention. By letting the world see Elizabeth Taylor, the symbol of pristine, untouchable beauty, hugging a dying AIDS patient, she shattered the myth of casual transmission. She destigmatized the disease in a way no Surgeon General's report could. She was using her body, the very body that had been so scrutinized and obsessed over, as a shield for the untouchables. But the autopsy of the body tells only half the story. To understand how she endured this physical torture, we must look at the psychological fortress she built and the specific souls she allowed inside it. Elizabeth Taylor did not survive this brutal landscape entirely alone. She did not seek the company of the healthy. She sought the fellowship of the fractured, a select group of similarly damaged souls who understood the language of pain. Throughout her life, biographers often noted Elizabeth Taylor's attraction to troubled men. The tabloids framed this as a weakness. However, if we view this through the lens of our forensic analysis, a different pattern emerges. She gravitated toward other damaged assets, men who had also been chewed up by the machinery of fame. The first and most visceral example of this dynamic occurred on May 12, 1956, with her co-star and closest friend, Montgomery Clift. Clift was a man of immense talent and immense fragility, plagued by alcoholism and the torture of being a closeted gay man in 1950s Hollywood. After leaving a dinner party at Taylor's home, Clift drove his car into a telephone pole. The crash was catastrophic. Elizabeth Taylor was the first on the scene. What happened next was not the reaction of a pampered starlet. It was the reaction of a combat medic. She crawled into the wreckage of the car. Clift's face was destroyed, his nose broken, his jaw shattered, his lip torn through. He was choking on his own dislodged teeth. While others stood back in horror, Taylor shoved her hand into his bloody mouth. She physically dug out the teeth, clearing his airway and saving his life. She then cradled his bloody head in her lap until the ambulance arrived, using her own body to shield his ruined face from the photographers. This moment cemented a lifelong bond. Taylor had literally put her hands inside his trauma. She protected him not just physically, but professionally. When the studio wanted to fire Clift because of his disfigurement, Taylor leveraged her own asset value, threatening to walk off the picture if they fired him. She became his insurance policy. We have already discussed Taylor's AIDS activism, but her relationship with Rock Hudson requires a specific forensic focus. Hudson was the ultimate MGM construct, a tall, handsome, heterosexual leading man manufactured by the system. In reality, he was a gay man living in a state of terrified suppression. When Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS, he became a biohazard to the industry. Taylor, who had spent her life managing her own physical deterioration in the public eye, became his confidant. She was one of the few people who did not recoil from his physical state. She understood the specific horror of the body betrayal. She provided him with a safe harbor, a place where he didn't have to perform the role of the healthy heartthrob. Perhaps the most controversial and misunderstood relationship of her later life was with Michael Jackson. The media mocked their friendship as a bizarre pairing of two eccentrics, A forensic psychological profile suggests they were actually twins, separated by generation but united by pathology. Both were fed into the entertainment grinder before puberty. Both were denied play, forced to work adult hours, and commodified by their families. By the time they met, both were suffering from profound chronic pain. Taylor had her back and hips. Jackson had the lingering effects of the Pepsi burn and his own complex medical history. Both were navigating the dangerous waters of prescription pain management. They understood the language of pills, the necessity of chemical numbing to survive the physical demands of their fame. Taylor became a fierce protector of Jackson because she saw her own history repeating itself in him. She saw the industry trying to consume him, the media trying to dissect him, and the public trying to own him. She was the veteran soldier trying to shield the new recruit from the same landmines she had stepped on. Having established her emotional sanctuaries and her physical survival, one final piece of the forensic puzzle remains. By the late 1980s, the body was failing, and the screen could no longer capture the perfection of her youth. To ensure her legacy survived the inevitable decay of her biology, Elizabeth Taylor executed one last strategic maneuver, escaping the physical realm entirely. She would create an asset that could never age, never break, and never bleed. By the late 1980s, the physical machinery of Elizabeth Taylor was in steep decline. The camera, once her lover, was becoming an adversary. High-definition lenses and the unforgiving lighting of modern cinema were not kind to a woman with parchment skin, a side effect of steroids, surgical scars, and a fluctuating waistline. The studios that once owned her were now hesitant to insure her. In a forensic sense, the visual asset was depreciating. However, Elizabeth Taylor executed one final brilliant maneuver to escape the limitations of her own biology. She shifted the medium of her fame from sight to smell. In 1987, she launched Passion, followed in 1991 by White Diamonds. This was not a vanity project. It was a strategic pivot. A perfume does not have wrinkles. A perfume does not have a fused spine. A perfume does not need a wheelchair. By bottling her essence, she created an avatar of herself that was immune to time and trauma. She could be 70 years old, recovering from brain surgery, and yet the woman wearing white diamonds in Iowa or Tokyo was experiencing the Elizabeth Taylor of 1950, glamorous, sensual, and perfect. She had finally created an asset that the doctors couldn't cut and the tabloids couldn't shame. The financial forensics of this period reveal a stunning reversal of power. During her peak acting years, MGM took the lion's share of the profits. Elizabeth Taylor was a salaried employee, a high-paid laborer on the factory floor. With her fragrance empire, she became the factory owner. White Diamonds remains one of the best-selling celebrity fragrances in history, generating over $1.5 billion in sales. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth Taylor was generating wealth that was not dependent on her ability to stand on a set for 14 hours a day. This wealth was her ultimate liberation. It funded her own medical care. It funded her AIDS activism, allowing her to ignore political pressure. And most importantly, it bought back her autonomy. The studios could no longer threaten her because she had more money than the studio heads. Even as she built this empire, her own body continued to face catastrophic failures. The warranty on the MGM asset had expired decades ago, yet the machine kept running, albeit with increasing mechanical interventions. In 2004, she was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, CHF. To understand why Elizabeth Taylor died of heart failure, we must look back to the amphetamines of the 1940s. The heart is a muscle. Like any pump, it has a finite number of beats. a finite capacity for stress. For nearly 70 years, Taylor's heart had been overclocked. Years of chemically induced hypertension forced the heart to pump against high pressure, thickening the ventricular walls. The chronic lung issues forced the heart to work harder to oxygenate the blood. The dramatic fluctuations in weight placed immense strain on the cardiovascular system. By 2011, her heart was simply worn out. It had become enlarged, floppy, and unable to pump blood effectively. Fluid began to back up into her lungs, the same lungs that had failed her in London in 1961. She was essentially drowning in her own body. On March 23, 2011, the machine finally stopped. Elizabeth Taylor died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. She was 79 years old. If we return to the stainless steel table where we began, looking at Elizabeth Taylor through the lens of a medical examiner, the conclusion is damning. The cause of death on the certificate reads congestive heart failure, but the forensic cause of death is systemic industrial exploitation. The story of Elizabeth Taylor is the story of a human being treated as a consumable object. MGM mined her for beauty, 20th Century Fox mined her for scandal, and the public mined her for entertainment. They took the ore, refined it into a star, and left the slag, the pain, the addiction, the scars for her to manage alone. She was the queen of Hollywood. But in the silence of the medical ward, stripped of the diamonds in the eyelashes, she was the queen of scars. Her body was the bill that Hollywood ran up, a bill that was paid in bone, blood, and tissue, but never settled with an apology. Forensically speaking, Elizabeth Taylor is not just a celebrity. She is an artifact. She is the product of a specific set of industrial conditions that no longer exist and can never legally be repeated. In the 1940s, the studio system operated in a regulatory vacuum. There were no child protective services on the lot. There were no OSHA regulations regarding stunt work for minors. There were no ethical boards overseeing the prescription of amphetamines to teenagers. MGM was a sovereign state, and Elizabeth Taylor was its subject. Today, a child actor cannot work more than a few hours a day. A doctor prescribing opioids to a 12-year-old for a workplace injury would lose their license and face prison time. Therefore, Elizabeth Taylor stands as a singular biological event in history. She is the last of the factory stars. She represents the apex of what the entertainment industry could produce when it had total totalitarian control over a human life, and the terrifying cost of that production. We will never see another Elizabeth Taylor, not because talent has vanished, but because the machinery that built her has been outlawed. As we close this forensic file, we must reconcile the two opposing images of Elizabeth Taylor, the goddess on the screen and the patient in the wheelchair. For decades, the world consumed her glamour. We stared at the violet eyes, we envied the diamonds, and we followed the romances. But we treated the glamour as if it were a natural resource, something that just existed. The medical evidence proves otherwise. The glamour was not a gift, it was a purchase. And the currency used to pay for it was the physical integrity of Elizabeth Taylor's body. The cost of the smile, a jawline sculpted by forced extraction. The cost of the equestrian scenes, a spine crushed and fused for a lifetime. The cost of the energy, a nervous system fried by amphetamines. The cost of the emotion, a heart enlarged and exhausted by chemically induced stress. The industry ran up the bill. The audience enjoyed the show. Elizabeth Taylor paid the check. She paid it in bone density, in liver function, and in scar tissue. Every time she appeared on a red carpet radiating that famous star power, she was performing a miracle of pain management. The final verdict of this inquiry is not one of pity, Pity is too small a word for Elizabeth Taylor. Pity implies weakness. The verdict is awe. She was an industrial accident that learned to talk. She was a broken doll that learned to lead an army. She took the very chemicals and scalpels that were used to control her and turned them into a narrative of survival. In the end, the medical examiner's table tells us the truth that the movie posters never could. Elizabeth Taylor was the toughest production Hollywood ever released. She was the heavy industry of the 20th century, disguised as a delicate flower. The file is now closed. The lights in the operating theater are dimmed. The Elizabeth Taylor that exists in the cultural memory is frozen in time, young, beautiful, and untouched. But the forensic truth remains. Beneath the diamonds there was steel. Beneath the makeup there were scars. And beneath the headlines there was a woman who held her breath for 70 years, carrying the weight of the world on a broken back, until she finally, peacefully, exhaled. She was the queen. Long may she rest.